Whether you eat them fresh, bake them in pies, or mix them into ice cream, cherries are a great summer afternoon snack. But they're not all the same, and they're definitely not sold that way. You want satisfaction from your stone fruits? Make sure you're avoiding these pitfalls. When you close your eyes and picture the perfect cherry, we're willing to bet you imagine a shiny red ball with a long, skinny stem sticking out. Well, all those cartoons depicting cherries that way were spot on. The ideal cherry should pretty much always have the stem still attached. As Frank Levering, owner of Levering Orchard, one of the most celebrated cherry orchards in Virginia, explains, the main reason for this is that keeping the stem in the cherry gives the fruit a longer lifespan. He said, cherries are fragile and, once picked, very perishable. If the armor of their skin is punctured in any way, as can often happen when picked without stems, they become even more perishable and generally don't keep as long, especially when very ripe. So even when you get your cherries home from the store, leave the stems in. You'll only want to take them out just before eating. This is especially true if the stem is bright green, as that's a clear sign of freshness. The longer that stem stays in place, the longer the cherry will stay fresh. Once you've made sure the stem's still there, the next thing you'll want to eye before you buy is the color. You might think that dark red cherries are generally the way to go, and that is sometimes true, but it's a fine line. Dark color often indicates ripeness, but cherries that are too dark might be overripe. Different kinds of cherries come in different colors, and they're not always dark.
Some cherries are a much darker red, but this particular kind, this Valera, this is the color they get when they're ripe.
Rainier cherries run the gamut from pale pink to golden yellow, but Bing cherries can be such a rich shade of mahogany, they're almost black. Levering says the best way to learn the ins and outs of what color each cherry should be at its best is mainly an experience game. Make sure you know which type of cherry you're eating, and then pay attention to which shades have the ripest tastes. But if you don't have years to study cherry hues, the general rule of thumb is the deeper the shade, the sweeter the fruit. And if the skin's shiny, that's another good sign. A good cherry should have firm skin close to bursting with the plump fruit underneath. Unfortunately, the time they spend in the sweet spot between underripe and hard and overripe and deflated is tragically short, so you want to be very careful about the choice you make. Levering insists that you can read a cherry's firmness without even needing to touch it. But if you have the opportunity to give the ones you want to buy a little squeeze, we'd recommend that as well. And once again, it's key to know the variety. Just like with the color, different types of cherries have different firmnesses, and there is a difference between hard and firm. If a piece of fruit feels too solid, it might not be ripe at all. In fact, Levering says many stone fruit orchards ship their underripe fruits out on purpose so that they don't spoil too quickly in transit. So the best thing you can do is buy local and give your cherries a little squish if you can. So far, we've talked about the best ways to spot a perfect cherry from an okay one, but knowing how to spot an outright bad cherry is also important. If you see cherries with visible bruises or dark spots, throw them out. If you find one that's soggy or moldy, get rid of it. And if it's split or leaking, steer clear. Once there's clear, visible damage like this, there really isn't anything you can do to save them. But some smaller imperfections are definitely not the end of the world. Levering says, minor blemishes in my experience are harmless, whether for cooking or simply eating. In some cases, they may even indicate that less spraying has been done. This is where buying loose cherries has the advantage over buying them in punnets. You know, those little green or clear basket things you see at grocery stores? If you see a moldy cherry in a loose pile, you can pick around it. But if you find one in a pre-packaged punnet, it's possible that all the ones touching it could also be contaminated. So the best thing you can do is sort through the punnet right away to get any offending cherries out of the mix as soon as possible. Like many fruits, cherries are only in season a few months out of the year, usually from late spring into summer. July is typically the peak for cherry quality, but any time between May and August, you should be in business. And this is important to the professionals, as Levering says cherries that have been chilled or shipped overseas will never come close to a fresh one. As many Levering Orchard visitors will attest, they might still taste all right, but the shorter the time between when a cherry's picked and eaten, the better.
Things that people like to say is, you ought to weigh us when we come in, and then weigh us when we go out, and charge us by the pound for how many cherries we've eaten while we're here.
Now, we're not saying don't buy cherries out of season, just brace yourself if you do. Once you've tasted a perfectly fresh cherry, whatever you'll find in the produce aisle in January won't hit the same. So if you live near an orchard, do yourself a favor and get your cherries straight from the source, maybe even pick them yourself. Alright, let's talk types. Cherries fall into two main camps, sweet and tart. Before you pick a bunch, it's worth knowing what kind you're dealing with. Sweet cherries are generally round, red, juicy, and full of sugar. They're the kinds of fruits you want to pop into your mouth right away. They're also often what you see in grocery stores because tart cherries tend to spoil more easily in transit. So you'll often find tart varieties, which many people use for baking, at farmers markets or in your frozen food aisle. According to Levering, they're usually shinier than sweet cherries and have a lighter color. But this is another case where you really want to know the specific cherry type you're buying, because there are exceptions to all these factors. North Star cherries, for example, are both dark and tart. If you don't see a label on your cherries, Levering recommends asking the seller what kind they're peddling. If they don't know, you're probably better off going somewhere else altogether. As he noted, this is another reason to buy at an orchard. Folks there grew that variety and can tell you what it is. Of course, you won't just find one type of cherry at your local grocer. There's usually a normal produce aisle and an organic section where the signs are always greener and the prices are always way higher. And sure, if you have the budget to buy organic, we say go for it. That probably means your cherries will have seen less exposure to pesticides and chemicals and may even have more nutrients and come from better farming practices. If it's the peak of the season, that's a great way to get some of the best tasting fruit possible. And even Levering says if you have an aversion to pesticides, paying that extra few dollars is probably worth it. But if your local market only carries regular cherries or organic doesn't fit into your budget, there's no need to stress. Just be sure to give your cherries a good rinse before eating and store them properly so they don't spoil too fast. Soaking them in a mix of cold water and baking soda or vinegar can also help remove residues and make them safer to eat. And whether or not you buy organic, you can always ask about the manufacturer's pesticide practices. As Levering notes, the growers are often on your side. He said, ask how many times they have been sprayed and with what pesticides. There are ways to reduce the number of sprays, as we do, and reducing sprays if possible is a good thing for consumers. When cherries are in season, we'd suggest buying them as often as possible if you're a fan. But there are definitely some red flags when it comes to their packaging you may want to be aware of. Levering suggests that you steer clear of cherries sold in pint or quart containers because then you're paying for all the air around the cherries as well. Instead, your safest bet is to buy by the pound. Additionally, if the cherries come in crates, check to make sure the wood is dry. Sometimes vendors will spray fruit with water to keep it looking fresh and appealing. That both adds to the weight, so they can charge more, and it can also cause the fruit to spoil faster. If you suspect that's the case, ask to have the cherries weighed separately before transferring them to a bag. On a similar note, plastic packaging covered in cling wrap can also be sketchy. It traps moisture, encourages mold, and can turn your perfectly good cherries into a soggy mess before you even get home. So don't be shy next time you're at the farmer's market. If something feels off, trust your instincts. These are your future snacks we're talking about. You have the right to ask questions. Once you've scored the most colorful, unblemished, firm yet juicy cherries imaginable, there are a few things you can do with them. You can eat them all at once, though that may cause a laxative effect, but there are also ways to make them last a while. We already know we want to keep the stems on and ditch the rotting ones, but you'll also want to hold off on washing your cherries unless you plan to eat them immediately. Water causes sogginess and speeds up the spoiling process, so you're much better off storing them dry. As for how to store them, we'll turn it over to Levering. To store cherries and make them last, refrigerating them is your best option. Cherries don't ripen after you pick them, but they do, especially when they're really ripe and it's hot, begin to deteriorate in quality. Properly stored, cherries keep for about 4 to 10 days, but if you keep them at room temperature, they could be past their prime by the end of the day. The fridge may keep your cherries good for a week or so, but let's say it's nearing the end of the summer and you don't want to say goodbye to those sweet, sweet stone fruits quite yet. That's where the freezer comes in. You're going to want to freeze your cherries in small batches so they aren't stacked up against each other, otherwise they'll freeze together into a big clump. If you do freeze them, you'll actually want to remove the stems and then rinse the cherries themselves. Next, and this is super important, dry the living hell out of them. You want your cherries absolutely bone dry before they go into the freezer. Now, place the cherries in a single layer on a baking sheet with plenty of space between each one. Then pop the tray into the freezer until they're firm and cold. Once they're frozen, you can then store them more closely packed together in freezer-safe containers or plastic bags. Just make sure you squeeze as much air out as possible before sealing them. Then, whenever you're craving some cherries, you just have to let the frozen treats thaw at room temperature or overnight in the fridge. Oh, and watch for the pits. They were hard before you froze them, so they'll basically be cold rocks by the time you pull them out. Now that you know how to spot a good cherry and take care of them once you get home, the only question left is, where do you find the best cherries?
If this goes through, I get the cherry.
Well, if you ask Levering, the answer will always be straight off the tree at an orchard. But if you don't have a cherry orchard near you, a farmer's market is your next best bet. He says he's found top-quality cherries even in major cities like New York and LA. Though in fairness, he can spot the difference between a good cherry and a great one better than most. He said, knowledge of what's truly ripe at full maturity is hard to come by for folks who only buy cherries in stores. So many new customers here have never tasted a fully ripe cherry before and never realized that was the case. So broaden your horizons, hit the farmer's market, or pick a day to go cherry picking. You'll be supporting local farmers and you'll never want to settle for a grocery store cherry again.